We're going to be talking today about ancient Rome. When we look at the history of ancient Rome, this is a civilization that is truly remarkable in terms of not only the complexity of the art, the architecture, the culture, but also in its impact that we see around us today. We talk about a lot of different groups, a lot of cultures, a lot of different artistic styles in this course, but really there are very few examples we can find that have the kind of impact that the Romans did. When we look around our modern world today, we still see many examples of architectural structures that are still closely based on earlier examples from the Romans. Structures like the Pantheon, structures like the Colosseum, have continued to this day to have a significant impact on our contemporary architecture, particularly the architecture that we see focused around state capitals, in our national capital. This often is intended to represent a tie back both to the glory and also to the earlier republican origins. When we talk about the ancient history of Rome, we're really looking at and discussing a city that goes back to about the 8th century. But early in Rome's history, it was really an Etruscan city. In fact, it was originally ruled by a series of Latin and Etruscan kings. The last of these being Tarquinia Superbus, who was expelled in 509 BC after some particularly egregious outrages which were perpetuated by his son. And so when he was kicked out, the Romans actually founded a constitutional government. This was, kind of a government that has some relationship to what we think of today when we talk about representation, in that it included a Senate. The Senate at the time, though, really it differed quite a bit from what we think of today when we think of a Senate. In this case, Senate literally meant a body of senators or senior citizens. And these were pulled, of course, only originally from the wealthy patrician class. Later, the lower plebeian classes are able to have an influence here, but initially, when we're first talking about the foundations of the Roman Republic, it was still fairly exclusive. In addition to the Senate, there were also two consuls. And again, originally the consuls came from the ruling class. However, later plebeians were also able to be included in this, which was an important step. Another office which was an important part of this system of government was the dictator. When we think of that word today, when we think of dictator, we have a different meaning. We think about someone who rules with pretty much absolute control and without any oversight. And the term does derive from this ancient Roman term, but that's not really what it originally meant. It actually refers to someone who was conferred special powers. So if, for example, you were at war, you might elect someone as dictator, get to basically establish a series of extraordinary powers to this individual governmentally in order to control the army, to levy taxes, to do whatever else is necessary given that period of time. The origins of Rome, by the way, are really more mythology than they are history. There is, of course, the story about Romulus and Remus, about Romulus slaying Remus after an argument and founding, of course, the city of Rome and the seven Capitoline hills, or the seven hills, rather, including the Capitoline hill. But we also have a story about a woman named Roma, and this actually goes all the way back to ancient mythology about the Trojan War and about this woman who survived and fled and founded Rome. So there's, again, lots of stories about the origins of this famous civilization that we're going to be looking at and discussing. When we begin talking about ancient Rome, some other key things that we need to know about the Republic. The Republic lasted from 509 to 27 BC, so we're talking about almost 4 centuries. This, again, as I mentioned earlier, begins with the expulsion of Tarquinia Superbus and ends when Octavian, who was the adopted nephew of Julius Caesar, receives the title Augustus, and by the way, essentially takes on all of the major governmental offices, and thereby becomes really the first emperor. Some of the major figures of this period include Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Julius Caesar, who we'll talk about later, and Mark Antony. So the ancient Romans, during this period in history, also began to really expand. Um, the Romans are quite famous, of course, for their ability to expand and to absorb territories, and they did this with great efficiency and skill. They managed to defeat the remaining Etruscan cities to their north, as well as the Gauls, and expanded well up into the north, into France, and even into Great Britain. To the south, they defeated the Samnites. They also defeated the Greek colonists that were there in Sicily, and also even into North Africa, and were successful in their battles against Carthage. Of course, that nearly ended in disaster, as Hannibal, of course, turns out to be quite the brilliant strategist and really comes pretty close to bringing the Roman Empire to its knees. But when we talk about Rome and we talk about Roman culture, Roman architecture, of course, is a really central, important part of what we discuss. And early in Rome's history, it was really a very simple habitation of simple wood structures and mud brick. But when we think of Rome today, we of course think of examples like we're looking at here in this map, this model of ancient Rome, cities of concrete and travertine and marble. And some of their architectural influence, of course, comes from the Etruscans. But there's certainly a lot of direct influence on their art from the ancient Greeks. When they conquered the Greek settlers, the colonists, who had been, of course, in Sicily and to the south, they brought back lots of plunder and spoils of war. And this plunder led to kind of a mania for Greek art. And Greek art was imported in large quantities. Greek artists were hired to create examples of things for Roman patrons. And we see that Greek style has a tremendous impact and influence. When we look at Roman art and Roman architecture, we'll see that. We'll see examples, of course, of the Ionic, the Doric, the Corinthian architectural elements, and we'll certainly see a direct influence of Greek sculpture when we look at Roman examples. The map that we're looking at here, which, by the way, was actually created under Mussolini's rule, shows us Rome really at its height in the 4th century of the Common Era. We can see the Flavian Amphitheater prominently displayed roughly in the center, the Circus Maximus to the left, the incredible aqueducts. There were many, many aqueducts that led directly into the city and brought water from an incredible distance. The amount of water that the Romans were able to really direct to their city is an incredible engineering feat. The Pont du Gard is one of the examples of aqueducts that survives in a little bit more of an intact condition that we'll look at and discuss. But the Romans were able to use technologies like this to such great efficacy that, of course, we see a tremendous growth in their cities, and they're able to establish these incredibly powerful bureaucratic and military organizations that managed to really just conquer the known world at the time. And Roman culture was really pretty amazing in terms of its expansiveness. It was incredibly multicultural. There are people worshiping an enormous variety of different religions, people from different religious backgrounds as well as ethnic backgrounds. And its sense of multicultural and diversity is really only paralleled by today's contemporary culture in many ways. We're going to begin here by really focusing on Roman architecture. And we'll, of course, talk about Roman sculpture and Roman painting as well. But the Romans are really probably the most famous for some of their architectural innovations. And these include the use of some pretty dramatic concepts and materials. Some of these, by the way, were lost after the fall of the Roman Empire and did not reemerge really until the modern era. The best known of these technologies, of course, is concrete. The Romans figured out how to do this, how to make and mix concrete, which is a new technology that allowed them to create incredible, structures in terms of the form, the height, complexity, and they learned how to build forms and pour concrete into molds in order to erect structures that would have otherwise really been impossible. They made this material, concrete, by mixing lime mortar, sand, water, and volcanic stone, and pouring it into wooden forms. And they didn't just have one formula. The Romans knew how to make several different kinds of concrete. So depending upon the specific application, for example, when we talk about the Pantheon, we'll see that there are types of concrete there that are used that are much heavier and denser, and then much lighter concrete using pumice, for example, in order to create a form that is much more lightweight in specific applications. Now, concrete by itself tends to be pretty ugly, particularly when we're talking about ancient concrete and the way that it was poured and manufactured. So it was generally faced out with other materials. We look at Roman buildings really from this period, and we generally tend to think about Roman buildings as being, marble or travertine and made out of beautiful stone. However, the stone was typically only a veneer, a facing, and their structures were really built primarily out of concrete and brick with stone revetment. And so we could also see, stucco, other materials on occasion, but again, many cases we're talking about in these major structures in terms of the primary functional architectural support is the use of concrete. So concrete, of course, is a key important material in technology. But the combination of concrete and some other ideas led to some unbelievable advances when it comes to the Romans' capability to create complex and large buildings. And what you're looking at here is an example of really how this can kind of all come together. We're seeing an image here of a barrel vault and a groin vault. So the concept of the barrel vault comes from the arch, and the Romans didn't invent the arch. The Greeks even were familiar with this concept, but the Romans master it. They're the ones who really understand how to use it. And the idea is that you create this arched structure, and it can be done with stone, using what are called voussoirs and a keystone on the top. And then, and we do see that used, but the Romans also figured out how to do this using concrete, which was incredibly important. And so the arch is a very strong, very durable form, and it carries the weight of the vault of the ceiling down to the floor and allows you to enclose space. And the Romans not only figured out how to create the barrel vault, and create this, by the way, by erecting forms out of wood, pouring concrete, moving the forms down, pouring additional concrete, etc., almost extruding the form, if you will. But they learned how to create even more complex and stronger shapes by intersecting barrel vaults. When you create an intersection of two barrel vaults, you get what's called a groin vault. And the groin vault, and you can see an image here on the right, becomes an unbelievably important form. And in fact, the groin vault is the primary architectural element really used when we're talking about creating large interior spaces, with the exception of the dome, of course, for an incredibly long period of time, really until the invention of modern materials such as steel and iron. And so when we look at ancient churches, even churches from the Gothic, from the medieval, from the Renaissance period, we see the use of this same technology, the use of groin vaulting. Of course, it'll get sophisticated a little in many ways and spiced up a little bit with things like pointed arches and ribbed vaults, but it's still essentially based on the principle of the groin vault. And this technology allowed the Romans to build some of the most amazing structures. And of course, we'll be looking at and discussing some specific examples here on our journey. The image that we're looking at here is an example of early Roman sculpture. And it serves as a way to really tell us quite a bit about how Roman art and Roman ideals differ from Greek art in many ways. So one thing, first off, that I'll mention is typically when we're talking about portraiture, if we're talking about the Greeks typically include the whole body. They believe that the head and the body are really inseparable, and both are necessary if we're really talking about creating a portrait. The Romans, not so much. The Romans believed that the head was sufficient for this purpose. And not that we don't see full body examples of artwork from the ancient Romans, but it was much more commonplace to simply have a portrait bust like we see here. Now, the Romans have this kind of interesting history when it comes to busts like this. The Romans would commonly take death masks from the deceased, and it was not uncommon to have examples, images like this, busts of your ancestors, of your deceased family members, which you would keep in a cabinet, essentially, in the home. And this was an important part of ancestor worship, if you will, or really more just a remembrance. When we talk about this practice, it may seem strange to us today, but most of us, of course, have pictures up in our home of relatives, and sometimes you have pictures of deceased relatives and family members, and that's really kind of what this was. It was a way for the Romans to maintain that connection to their ancestors and also to identify their lineage. But when we talk about the ancient Greeks and we talk about portraiture, we typically see idealism. Now, when we talk about the Hellenistic period, of course, we see that that shifts and changes. But here, when we take a look at the Roman Republic, there's a style of artwork which is dominant. And this style of artwork is something that we refer to as verism, which is the emphasis on accuracy of depiction and even emphasis of non-idealized features. We see that people are rendered in a way that is certainly not flattering, not idealized, but instead is intended to emphasize other attributes. So in this case, we may be looking at a man who could have been, we don't know, for example, we know he's a patrician from Otricoli, but he could have been a member of the ruling class, or who knows. But he's rendered here in a way that shows him as being old and wise. And the idea is that if we're talking about someone who is going to be a member of I don't know, let's say the Senate, you don't want to elect someone who's beautiful. You want someone who is trustworthy, experienced, knowledgeable. And verism is a technique that kind of emphasizes some of those attributes. And we see that clearly here when we look at this example. One of the things that's a little odd, however, is that we do also see examples later of these same concepts of showing these very realistic, aged, wizened faces, but then they are sometimes attached to perfect, idealized young bodies, which is quite incongruous and yet seems to have been a popular style. So we're next going to be looking at and discussing the transition to the early empire. So when we talk about the ancient Roman Republic, of course, again, we do see the creation of sculpture that uses the principles of verism. We see the use of the arch and the barrel vault, as well as the groin vault, use of concrete, and we see a lot of these foundational technologies that really form the basis for what we think of when we talk about Roman art. But we're going to now be talking a little bit about some major shifts and changes that occur, and this really begins with a man who many people are familiar with, named Julius Caesar. And Julius Caesar was never emperor. He was not a Roman emperor, but he was a man who'd been elected as the dictator, in fact, dictator perpetuus, or dictator for life. And Julius Caesar was a very powerful man, and some of the changes that he instituted really threatened a lot of the other members of the Roman upper class and the powerful groups, of course, that surrounded him. And as a result, he was assassinated on the Ides of March on the floor of the Senate. But some of the things that he kind of set in motion led to some incredible civil strife. First off, led to several warring factions within the Roman government. And one of these warring factions, of course, was his adopted nephew, a man named Octavian. And Octavian, we know better as Augustus, which means the first, really. And he adopts the name Augustus Caesar after he takes power, which is, of course, where we know him from. But the early empire begins with the reign of Augustus. His family, by the way, is referred to as the Giulio Claudian family, and they establish a dynasty of rulers. And they really are in control for an extended period of time. We have, the Giulio Claudian family includes Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Nero being the last of these, who is forced essentially to a rather ignoble death, which he really kind of had coming. Nero is actually forced to kill himself, to commit suicide. And then, of course, we have, after Nero, we have the rule of the Flavian dynasty. And the first of these is a general, a man named Vespasian, who takes control. And Vespasian's family include Titus and Domitian, who come later. And their family is really probably the best known for the creation of one of the most iconic examples of Roman architecture, that being the Flavian Amphitheater, better known simply as the Colosseum. Here we're looking at an incredible, really remarkable image, which represents Augustus, of course also known as Octavian. So we talked a little bit already about this, but Octavian, as mentioned previously, was essentially the adopted nephew of Julius Caesar. And Octavian, ended up getting into a battle with Mark Antony and Queen Cleopatra of Egypt, by the way, and defeated the two of them in 30 BC. And as a result of this, we end up having the end, really, of the Roman Republic shortly thereafter. Augustus, after he defeats the two of them in battle, manages to really consolidate his power, and the Senate confers the title of Augustus on him, and of course becomes known as Augustus Caesar. So one of the other things that's interesting about this is that, originally, in terms of, looking at it from a technical standpoint, the Roman Republic was still intact, you could say, in that all of the original offices, the different individual offices, still existed. And those offices included things like the princeps, which is the first citizen. We have the consul, we have the imperator, which is the commander-in-chief, and also the Pontifex Maximus, which was the head priest. However, the difference was that at this point in time, what happens is that Augustus takes on all of those offices. He becomes all of those. He becomes the princeps, the Pontifex Maximus, the dictator, all of it. So he is in absolute control. And Augustus actually manages, after defeating Mark Antony and Cleopatra, to institute something that we call the Pax Romana, or the Pax Augustus, which means the Roman peace, or the Augustan peace. After he takes control, there's a fairly long period of peace in the Roman world. He had managed to defeat all of his enemies. There wasn't really anybody left to defeat. And so as a result, we have this period of prosperity and also quite a bit of dramatic architectural and cultural growth when we look at the Roman world. So the image that we're looking at here is an example of sculpture that we know as the Augustus of Primaporta. And this is a very famous statue of Augustus. And it's also an incredibly powerful work of propaganda. When we look at this statue, we can see some pretty amazing features. First off, we can see that Augustus is dressed kind of oddly. So he's wearing a combination of unusual garments. He's wearing military armor, and yet he's also wearing the drapings, to toga, really, of a senator. And so this is kind of confusing, because you wouldn't wear your armor into the political office, and you wouldn't wear this garment, this draped garment, into battle. And so this is kind of unusual, but it actually makes a whole lot of sense, because what we're seeing here is a representation that shows Augustus as wielding both military and political power. And so the statue is intended to communicate a variety of things to us in a very deliberate way. Another very obvious, unusual aspect that we can see here is that down at his feet, we can see what looks like a little baby. And that is, in fact, Cupid. And if we look carefully, we can also see that Cupid is, in fact, riding a dolphin. And you might wonder what this has to do with Augustus. But it actually goes back to Julius Caesar. And remember that he was the adopted nephew of Julius Caesar. Well, in this case, Caesar claimed that he could trace his lineage all the way back to Venus, that he had divine heritage. And what we see in this particular case is that Augustus is also adopting that heritage. And by including this figure here of Cupid and the dolphin, he is showing his personal lineage, his history, going back to Venus. And so this is another symbolic gesture which shows his power and his birthright in that manner. And there's lots of other symbols that we can see if we look closely at this statue. So when we look carefully here at the image of Augustus, we can see that he's represented in an idealized fashion. Now, this is very different from what we saw during the Republic. Instead of this concept of verism, showing age, showing experience, what we're seeing instead is someone who's represented in a godlike fashion. He's shown with powerful musculature, with a young, idealized physique and face. And so that's something that's also interesting, because Augustus, regardless of his age, throughout his reign, is always shown as a young man, even when he is most certainly not a young man. So if we want to talk a little bit about the roots of this sculpture, we can go back and look at an earlier example that we've talked about in depth. So on the left here we have the Doryphoros, which of course is the famous example created by Polykletos. And we can see here how this example has certainly influenced the Roman example of statuary on the right. We can see the virtually identical pose when we look at the legs. We can see the same contrapposto stance, the foot back and slightly tilted, the same tilt of the body. The only real key difference that we have here is essentially the positioning of the arms. And Augustus has his arm up and out in what is really a pose or a gesture of oration, which is a way to kind of communicate that he's speaking or he's addressing the crowd. And other than that, though, the similarities here in terms of structure and pose are really quite remarkable. The style of this statue is very often referred to as Polykletan, as it has its origin clearly in the Greek example on the left. Here again we can see a close-up of Cupid and also the dolphin he rides at the feet of Augustus. And once again this is intended to show his lineage, to show that he is descended from Venus. Of course he was adopted, as we mentioned previously, by Julius Caesar, who had claimed this lineage. And so he's showing this continuation of the family line. When we look at the breastplate or cuirass here that Octavian or Augustus Caesar is wearing, we can also see some other interesting concepts and symbolisms. First off, the breastplate's covered with figures, and these figures are intended to communicate fairly specific messages to us. There is some debate over the identification of some of these figures, but essentially the message overall is pretty clear. It's intended to communicate to us really that Augustus has the gods on his side. He's shown as a victorious general in the military, the bringer of the Roman peace, and as a powerful and dynamic leader. In the center of the cuirass here, we can also see, in fact, two specific figures which are called out, a Roman and a Parthian. And we can actually see the Parthian returning military standards to the Roman. And this is a specific reference to an international diplomatic victory that Augustus was able to conclude in 20 BCE when these standards were returned to Rome after having been lost in a previous battle. As we've already discussed, the Roman Empire is broken up into a series of dynasties that we talk about, these organizations of family rule. And the first of these dynasties, of course, is the Giulio-Claudian dynasty, which begins with Augustus and ends with Nero. So a little bit about Nero. Nero was not a very good emperor. Nero made some pretty significant mistakes. One of the things that Nero did that really turned the population against him, he pretty much bankrupted the Roman Empire by spending all of this money on lavish excesses for his own personal gain. Enormous pleasure yachts and all sorts of things were built. Probably the single biggest egregious issue was the fact that he basically tore out the heart of Rome. There was an enormous fire that occurred, and there's some speculation as to the nature of the fire, right in the center of Rome, really. And rather than rebuild the city, he leveled everything and had his own personal, private, pleasure palace erected. So he had a lake created for himself. He had this enormous palace built that was called the Domus Aurea, or Golden House. It was incredibly large and complex. The walls were inlaid with precious and semi-precious stones. It was unbelievably, unfathomably expensive, ostentatious, complex, and massive, and incredibly costly. And so eventually, because of the excesses of Nero, his own guards ended up chasing him down after really the Senate had finally had enough of him, and people kind of revolted. And in 68 of the Common Era, he was forced to kill himself. After Nero died, there was a fairly bloody but brief conflict, and the man who emerged victorious from this conflict was a previous general who had been a general for both Claudius and Nero by the name of Vespasian. And Vespasian seized control. He was a very no-nonsense militaristic figure, a very powerful leader. And Vespasian did some pretty smart things. One of the first things he did was he attempted to reclaim the center of Rome that Nero had essentially befouled and he leveled the Domus Aurea, basically buried it, filled it in. And he also did something else, which was pretty extraordinary. So where there had been previously a lake, he drained the lake and erected a new and very important structure. Vespasian kind of, I think, knew the worth of the will of the people, and he knew that, if he wanted to be successful as emperor, he had to engender the people's, their passions, their beliefs, and their sympathies. So he decided to create a structure that would, to be quite honest, really distract the people from any other things that were going on, and hold a series of games, about 100 days worth of games in this new building. So he decided to create something we know today as the Colosseum. Back in the day, it was simply called the Flavian Amphitheater. So here we're looking at a real masterpiece of engineering. Now, the Colosseum, as we look at it today, is certainly a ruin. It has underwent some pretty horrific things. It was severely damaged by an earthquake at one point, and also it has been used as a quarry throughout the Baroque and the Renaissance eras. Stone was stripped from the surface in many places and used for the building of churches and other structures throughout Rome. So it's been pretty heavily pilfered. But a little bit about the original construction and design. So it is, as we've mentioned, an amphitheater. Now, we know what a theater is. We've talked about the concept of a Greek theater. And what the Romans do in the design and creation of this object is basically take two of those. Amphi, meaning two, both in this case. So, and we put two of them, front to front, and what you end up with is this double theater. And rather than building it into a hillside, like the Greeks would have, the Romans instead build their own hillside, essentially, by using barrel vaulting and concrete to create the structure that we see here. And this is a truly ingenious structure. It's also really quite massive. Vespasian never saw the completion of the building. He died before it was finished. But the building, as we can see here, it's enormous. It's a huge oval, and the structure was capable of seating, some people estimate, around 50,000 people. Could have been a little more, could have been a little less, but somewhere in the neighborhood of about 50,000 people. There were approximately 76 entrances. There's some debate about whether all of those were actual physically used entrances. There are kind of specific ones for the gladiators, etc. But essentially the way it would work is you'd get a numbered token, which would take you to your specific gate. You'd enter the gate, and then through that gate you'd access your seats. Women had to actually take the standing room only at the very, very top, unless you're one of the Vestal Virgins. But we have a series of different levels, and when we look at these levels, we'll see that they are actually designed in a way that references specifically earlier forms of Greek architecture. So looking here at this image of the remaining interior, the ruins of the inside of the Colosseum, we can see how the barrel vaults were used, and also how concrete and brick was used as really the primary building materials of this structure. And of course, the exterior was revetted out in beautiful stone, but the interior, as we can see here, inside of the building, would have been much more simple in terms of its facing and construction. And this gives us some idea of how they were able to accomplish such an incredible engineering masterpiece. Here we're looking at a couple of images, the exterior again, and also now the interior of the Colosseum, looking in at the floor. So when the Colosseum was originally completed, it didn't have this extravagant complex of tunnels and passageways underneath the floor. These were a later addition. And in fact, early in its history, the Colosseum, in its initial opening games, at one point was actually flooded. Water was diverted from an aqueduct. The interior of the Colosseum was partially filled with water, and there was actually a mock naval battle with thousands of participants that took place inside of the structure. Now later, of course, we have this complex series of trapdoors and passageways which were created underneath the floor. And the floor, by the way, would have been covered in sand. Now, there's a term that we use frequently today to describe venues where people go and see contests and other sorts of things. We call them, in many cases, arenas. And arena actually comes from the Latin word meaning sand. The floor of the Colosseum, or the Flavian Amphitheater, was actually covered in sand. And this was really primarily to soak up the blood of the animals and gladiators that fought within. The exterior of the Colosseum is actually faced with some of the classical orders of architecture that we've looked at and discussed previously. Now, the very, very bottom level has what's pretty close to the Doric. It's a variation on the Doric known as the Tuscan. The primary difference being simply that it has a base, whereas the true Doric order does not. The second story, as we can see here, is the Ionic elevation. Above that, we have Corinthian columns. And then finally, at the very, very top, we have another variation on the Corinthian. But if we look, actually, we can see that the bottom three layers here, the bottom three sets of structure are all what are called engaged columns. So essentially, it's like a half column mounted to the wall, attached to the construction. Whereas at the very top level, what we have is what's called a pilaster. So these are flat. They do not have the rounded aspect that we see in the bottom three levels. So we really have, again, essentially three elevations here used to describe the exterior. These are, of course, used to frame arches. And this format, by the way, that we see here used on the Colosseum becomes an incredibly popular format. And we'll see this echoed and reiterated over and over again all the way through the Renaissance and even into examples in contemporary architecture. You can also, from this vantage point, see the little holes in the very, very top and little bases immediately below the holes. These would have held poles, which supported something called the velarium, which was a shade sail, so that the interior of the Colosseum would have been shaded and covered. From this vantage point, we can kind of get to see a little bit more of how the Colosseum itself was structured. And this, of course, is actually due to some significant damage that occurred from an earthquake later in its history. But here you can see the outer wall on the far left side, which, by the way, at its maximum height, is approximately 160 feet high, the size of about a 16-story building. But then inside of that, you can see how it steps inward and see the multiple layers, the levels of construction to get an idea of how this structure was created. The building has served many purposes. It actually, at one point, was used as a church with Stations of the Cross, but then largely abandoned during the medieval period and into the Renaissance, when it was used really essentially as a quarry for stone. But today, of course, it is a very famous tourist attraction and probably one of the most important and iconic examples of Roman architecture.